if I can just ask you to turn off your phones before we begin, so that they don't interrupt our speaker. Sure, absolutely. Before I begin our celebration this evening, because it is a celebratory event, I just want to take a couple of minutes to tell you all about what to expect in our program, the parallel programs here and at New Cairo during the spring 2016. Our next event here in Tahrir will be on Tuesday, March 22nd, and this will be a lecture entitled Toward Developing a Critical Urban Lexicon, Cairo Urban Resource Library and the Challenge of Translation and Terminology. And this lecture will be given by Omar Nagati and Beth Stryker, co-founders of Cluster, the Cairo Lab for Urban Studies, Training and Environmental Research. Our second lecture, and last actually in the semester, is entitled Self-Translation, Faithful Rendition or Rewriting, and it is by Muhammad Tawfiq, novelist and former diplomat, and it will be on Tuesday, April 19th in Oriental Hall at 6 p.m. On the other side of the world, in New Cairo, we have a parallel lecture, our interdisciplinary series, and in that series we have three lectures lined up. The first one is by one of our AUC graduate students, and it promises to be an excellent lecture, and I'm very proud actually to be hosting her in that series as the first speaker. Her talk is entitled A Translator in the Crossfire, Bassem Youssef and the International Emmys Opening Speech. And this will be on Monday, February 29, therefore this coming Monday, at the new campus at 1 p.m. The second one is by my colleague, Ellen Kenny, in Islamic Art and Architecture, and her talk is entitled Islamic Art and its Intra-Disciplinary Translations. That will be on Monday, March 28, 2016, also at 1 p.m. They're all during assembly hour. Our third one is by theater director and playwright and translator Ahmed Al-Attar. His talk is entitled Beyond the Text, Theatrical Translation in the Age of Globalization, and that will be on Monday, May 9th. So I hope that you'll be able to join us for some, if not all, of these very engaging lectures. And now we can begin to celebrate. We are tonight celebrating a long journey of cooperation, really, between one of the Arab world's most distinguished scholars of comparative and Arabic literature and an American poet who has immersed himself in Arab culture and literature. This celebration really crowns, as I said, a very long journey of collaboration that was recently awarded the Sheikh Hamad Award for Translation and International Understanding for the collaborative translation between Ferial Ghazoul and John Verlenden of the Chronicles of Majnun Layla and selected poems by Qassim Haddad. Ferial Ghazoul, of course, is no stranger to all of you here in the room. She is professor of English and Comparative Literature at the American University in Cairo and has been educated in Iraq, Lebanon, Europe, and the US, therefore, very global kind of background already. She has published extensively on medieval comparative literature and post-colonial studies and is the editor of Alif, Journal of Comparative Poetics. She has taught seminars on translation and translation studies, and of course is a distinguished translator herself with many, many works to her name. She has translated and co-translated from Arabic into English, Arabic and French in the following genres: poetry, Muhammad Afifi Matar, Muhammad Sulaiman, Qassim Haddad, Fadwa Touqan, Murid Barghouti, Jabra Ibrahim Jabra, Sami Mahdi, Adonis, Mahmoud Darwish, Abdelmenem Ramadan, Amal Dunqul, Ibrahim Nasrallah, Anton Shammas, Nazik al-Malaika, but also a translator of novels, Edward Kharrat, short stories by Anita Desai, autobiography, Muhammad Afifi Matar's autobiography, critical theory, Edward Said, Abdul Wahab Mu'addib, Louis Althusser, Paul Ricoeur, Charles Sanders Peirce, Michel Rifater, essays also, translations of essays by Ibrahim al-Kouni, Ahla Mustaghanmi, Alifa Rifat, Abdul Wazin, Saadi Youssef, and the list goes on. These are only the translations, actually. If I were to go into her academic and scholarly publications, she will have no time to speak, I think. John Verlenden, who is unfortunately not with us, but will be, I hope, well represented even in his absence, is an American academic, writer, and award-winning translator of Arabic literature. He obtained a BA in English literature from Rhodes College and an MFA in creative writing from Louisiana State University. He has taught at a number of universities in the US and the Middle East, including the American University in Cairo. I will dare say something very brief about the poet himself, whose translated work is being celebrated. That is Qassim Haddad, who has reworked, therefore, the classical Majnun Layla into what now has become, an award-winning translation. And his poems and his copious output, ranging from aphoristic short poems to longer free verse experiments, have led to international recognition and celebration, actually, as you can see from the award itself. I started by saying that this particular award, the Sheikh Hamad Award, comes to crown a long history of a collaboration between Ferial Ghazoul and John Verlenden, because it actually is a journey that goes back a long way. They collaborated on the translation of Quartet of Joy, a book of poetry by Muhammad Afifi, which was also an award-winning translation. They were awarded the Arkansas Prize, correct? For that translation of Afifi Matar. They also collaborated on the translation of Edward Kharrat's, late Edward Kharrat's novel, Rama wa Tinnin, Rama and the Dragon. That, by the way, is a novel that was awarded the Naguib Mahfouz Prize here at AUC. Together they wrote and obtained a grant through the NEH in order to translate Qassim Haddad's poetry. That was in 2010, and that collaborative work is what then brought them into the this prize-winning sort of mode, because the translation was awarded twice, actually. Once the Arkansas Arabic Translation Award in 2013, and then more recently in 2015, correct? 2015, the Sheikh Hamad Award. 14. 14?
Oh, sorry, 15.
15.
Yes,
yes. 2015, all right? And I would just like to say that this kind of work between two translators who actually also come from two different cultures, but also two different professional backgrounds, is exemplary. It really is what translation is about. Many of us have sort of images of translators sitting alone in their room with piles of dictionaries around them, working alone and agonizing over texts, when in fact that's not the case. I think translation happens in conversation, whether informal or formal. And I think this is a fantastic example of how you can build on the collaborative work over several years. And I'm sure that the journey shows in the projects that Ferial and John have undertaken together as translators. Okay, I've taken too much time already. I just want to say that Ferial Ghazoul is no stranger to this center. She was among the first guests to speak here. When she spoke last, her lecture was entitled "The Translator as Hero." And here she is today, indeed, the translator as hero. And this evening's talk, therefore, is entitled "Together, Collaborative Translation of the Untranslatable." Thank you. Please help me welcome Dr. Ghazoul.
Is there a light here? Is there a light, Samia? A light? I can still read if they don't have one.
There's no light.
النور.
I don't think it doesn't work.
It's okay. It's okay. It's okay. Don't worry about it. Don't worry about it. مش مهم. I'll manage, okay? I want to start by thanking Samia Mehwez for having me speak today in the series of In Translation. This is not the first time, as she mentioned, that I speak in the series, though this time my talk is based more on my personal practice in collaborative translation. My first talk in the series was on the translator as a principal character in fiction. It focused on the new fiction in Arabic, English, and Spanish, marked by situating the translator as the protagonist and the significance of such move of the translator hyphen character from being a secondary persona to becoming the protagonist and the hero. The presentation was developed into an article entitled "The Arab Translator as Hero" and was published in the London-based journal, The Translator. I'll be happy to send you an electronic copy if interested. I also want to thank all friends and colleagues who wrote me to congratulate me for the award my co-translator and I received for our translated book of Qassim Haddad, Chronicles of Majnun Layla and Selected Poems. This, in fact, is the second award our translation receives. The first was awarded jointly by the University of Arkansas and Syracuse University, which made it possible to publish the translation in the series of Middle East Literature in Translation, edited by Michael Beard and Adnan Haidar. The second prize that we received from an independent foundation in Qatar named after Sheikh Hamad was for translation and international understanding. I particularly value the dimension of international understanding when it is associated not so much with diplomacy, but with literature and specifically poetry. In today's talk, I want to discuss collaborative translation and specifically how our experience of paired translators contributed to the final literary product. In many ways, it's a talk in praise of collaborative translation. To say this is not to diminish the importance of solo translators, many of whom are sitting here in the audience, but to offer an alternative mode, particularly when addressing what I have called the untranslatable in the title. What is untranslatable? Texts or phrases whose sense cannot be expressed in another language are said to be untranslatable. In our culture, we think of the Quran as untranslatable. But in fact, the Quran has been translated, but even then, such transposition does not carry the title of translation. Instead, it's referred to as interpretation. Arthur Arbery's translation of the Quran in English or Jacques Berg's translation of the Quran in French are not to be confused with the Word of God which was revealed in Arabic. There is a theological controversy over translation of sacred texts, be they Buddhist, Christian, or Islamic, given the holiness of the text and by extension the pitfalls of not rendering it correctly. The Bible, unlike the Quran, was written in 3 languages, Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek. And thus, it's a multilingual text which invites translation. Since very few command these 3 languages, translation of the Bible into other languages has ushered teamwork translation. As for the Quranic translation, the Senegalese philosopher and professor at Columbia University, Souleymane Bachir Diène, argues that there are 2 kinds of translations. One, translations related to the Quran. One is vertical, from God to man. That is the transfer of what is in Al-Lawh al-Mahfuz, the preserved tablet, into discourse delivered by Gabriel to the prophet. And this is a unique transposition or transfer or translation which cannot recur. According to Diène, there is a horizontal translation from one human language to another, which opens the Quran to other tongues and that can occur and recur. There are also translations of the Quran undertaken as teamwork by King Fahd Complex. Team translation, whether that of scripture or of diplomatic documents, is usually pre-structured and hierarchical in organization, quite different from co-translation with its dialogical procedures. My own interest in the poetic text that is known as untranslatable, that's dubbed as untranslatable, the text that is anchored in its source language in such a way that when it's transposed into another, it loses its poetic quality. Frost is famously and frequently quoted, having said, "Poetry is what gets lost in translation." But such texts, in my opinion, are not impossible to translate, but are very challenging for the translator. In English, we don't have terms that distinguish between, I'm going to use the Arabic term, al-nas al-ta'jizi lit-tarjama, the text that cannot be translated, such as puns, and al-nas al-musta'si ala tarjama, the text that's very challenging for translation, such as poetic texts. In a recent article by Amira Khashgari entitled "The Paradox of Translating the Untranslatable," she argues that the very concept of equivalence, usually the principle of translation, has been questioned and that non-equivalence, I quote her, non-equivalence constitutes an equally legitimate concept of translation process. End of quotation. Of course, we all know that equivalence is never total and is always partial. Thus, to avoid the dichotomy of equivalence versus non-equivalence, such other terms were coined, such as dynamic equivalence or functional equivalence, have been proposed. Surprisingly, but maybe not so surprisingly, not much has been written in translation studies on collaborative translation, although some are taking note of it and trying to theorize this subfield based on experience and practice. This effort, these studies on collaborative translation hardly touch on what is being done in the field of translating from Arabic collaboratively. Much more is being discussed on co-translation from Chinese, for example. There will be an international symposium specifically on researching collaborative translation in Hong Kong this spring, in April 2016. In my early practice and experience of translation, I learned something which I consider valuable from the renowned translator, editor, poet, and critic, Salma Khadra Jayusi, who asserted that only a poet can render a poem in another language. That was her perspective in translating her edited anthology, Modern Arabic Poetry, in 1987. She introduced, on a large scale, collaborative translations where a scholar of Arabic would translate a poem to English, and then an English-speaking poet will revise it to give its poetic essence. She would then decide on the first product by judging the Arabic original and the English translation. She at times rejected translations by the English-speaking poet because she felt that what the second translator did with the draft of the first translator compromised the tone of the Arabic poem. My only critique of this mode is that the first translator is not in dialogue with the second translator in this process, and thus it is somewhat impersonal and more akin to editing or adaptation than co-translation. Let me at this point distinguish between confusingly similar terms, collaborative translation and cooperative translation, both types of co-translation. A translator may be a solo translator and thus an independent translator. He or she can either be a native speaker of the source language, as in the case of Samia Mehr's translating Muna Prince, My Name is Revolution, which is not in our library, by the way. No, not the translation. Okay. Or the translator is a native speaker of the target language, as in the case of Dennis Johnson Davis translating Tayyib Saleh, Season of Migration to the North. In the Arab world, we often have a translator of a text from English to Arabic, and another translator, presumably more experienced, checks it or edits it. We call this muraja'a, an overview, but not a co-translation. I distinguish between cooperative translation and collaborative translation, though often they are used to mean the same thing interchangeably. Cooperative translation is when two translators or more cooperate to translate a work or an anthology, as Radwa Ashur and others translated to Arabic the Cambridge History of Literary Criticism, 20th Century Historical, Philosophical, and Psychological Perspectives. If I were to translate with Samia Mehrd's, for example, an Arabic novel to English, where we divide the work between us and revise each other drafts as we go along, I would call this cooperative translation. Al-Tarjama al-Ta'awuniyya. Because both Samia and I are native speakers of Arabic, and we are consolidating our efforts. In the case of collaborative translation, Al-Tarjama al-Tadafuriyya, there is a translator who is a native speaker of the source language and a translator who is a native speaker of the target language. They complement each other. When it comes to poetry and poetic texts, a scholar knowledgeable of the source language and a poet in the target language would be preferable pair. For as Jayusi had put it, only a poet can produce a poem. But this pairing in collaborative translation of poetic texts is not a matter of bringing one scholar in the source language plus one poet in the target language. It's not a mechanical combination. There should be a symbiotic relation between them, a complementarity and dialogue. In our case, John Verlenden, the American poet, and Ferial Ghazoul, the Iraqi scholar of comparative literature, had plenty in common. We taught in the same university, AUC. John lived in the Arab world for 15 years in Jordan and Egypt. He knew Arabic enough to understand semantic and syntactic nuances when I pointed them out. He was immersed in Arab culture and had read modern Arabic literature in translation. I studied in the US, Columbia University, and I have been teaching English and comparative literature for years, and many of my students are here. John taught rhetoric and creative writing in the unit that was part of the Department of English and Comparative Literature before it became a department of its own, Department of Rhetoric and Composition. John and I became colleagues and friends, and I felt we were on the same wavelength, aesthetically and ideologically. Above all, we have the same obsession with precision and perfection, the same fascination for words and poetic ambiguity. I remember calling on him to help me in translating an Arabic epigraph for Aleph, Journal of Comparative Poetics. Not only did he present a good poetic translation along with alternatives based on my literal and free translations of the epigraph, he was also willing to engage, in fact welcoming, a discussion of semantic nuances of the Arabic and how they worked in English. John and I have translated 3 poetic books, as Samia mentioned, Quartet of Joy. Can we have them? Can you present the covers anyway? Muhammad Afifi Matas, University of Arkansas, 97. Quartet of Joy, that's Quartet of Joy. This cover is by Calderbank, and it's calligraphy, Arabic calligraphy, Shar. It's written on Shar. And we also translated together Rama and the Dragon by Edward Kharrat, AUC Press, 2002, and Chronicles of Majnun Layla by the Bahraini poet Qassim Haddad, Syracuse University Press, 2014. Now, anyone who is familiar with these works will know what a difficult, if not impossible, task we undertook to translate these works. I remember when I asked Muhammad Anani, the well-known translator, to translate a poem by Muhammad Afifi Matar for an issue of Aleph on Egyptian poetry of the 1970s, he said to me that first, one has to translate Matar to Arabic, given the level of obscurity and ambiguity in his writing, then to English. As for Kharrat's Rama and the Dragon, which is a prose poem of epic length, the author himself, a well-known translator, said it is untranslatable. And yet, he was pleased with our translation. John and I have made it a point to be in close contact with the authors we translate. Matar was helpful. He knew English better than he claimed, and he was helpful in deciphering for us some lines. Kharrat read our translation and made a few revisions here and there. Qassim Haddad felt that it was best to leave it to critics and translators to figure out his meaning. Still, he was willing to explain some points which puzzled us when we asked him. The ambivalence of Haddad is captured in his assertion, which we use as the epigraph of our translation of Chronicles of Majnun Layla. He says this, and I quote him in translation: "The writer is not enslaved by forms. He creates and betrays forms simultaneously." Creates and betrays. There is a debate in translation studies about which language should be privileged in a translation. The target language, to please the readers without disrupting their expectation of what reads well, or privileging the source language and thus give the readers the pleasure and the jolt of experiencing the strange power of the foreign text in one's language, as Walter Benjamin called for. At times, this debate takes the form of colonial versus post-colonial mode of translation practices, with an overuse of terms such as domestication and foreignization. The whole debate seems as if one has to choose between being loyal to the source language or the target language, which seems to me a false problem. One can both be loyal to the source language and the target language, with the understanding that in poetic translation, loyalty is the interface of treason. What we have opted for in our collaborative translation is to walk on the rope without falling on either side of it. For us, it has never been a matter of bargaining between the target language and the source language, such as 50% for each in our collaborative translation. This is not a commercial partnership, but a literary partnership. We want to reproduce the source, but keep its poetic allure in the target language. Let me, at this point, cite what John has recently written about collaborative translation of poetry, specifically for this talk. So the following is in his own words. So from now, for a few minutes, it will be John reading. I view my English language role as secondary to that of the primary translator, but of no less importance. I am ultimately responsible for the quality of the finished creative writing. That is not in truth the way things work, but that's how I feel. And feelings in the work of translation are essential. Let's look at it in a straightforward way. I rely on my primary translator to furnish me with the beginning text without which I could do nothing. But what I mean by beginning text is something more than a word-by-word first translation. It often includes a choice of English words for any single Arabic word, as well as notes about possible strategies of the writer that the primary translator is observing as she translates through the text. For instance, there may be a metaphor or a lengthy conceit or an extended allusion or a special tone that's being used. The primary translator must point these things out to me. This means the primary translator must not only be expert in the language, but in the culture surrounding the language, both now and in the past. Otherwise, she will miss important subtextual meanings that the writer originally meant to produce, often at no small cost of creativity and structural planning. In short, the primary translator must convey not only a draft, but something much more insubstantial or evanescent besides. She must convey the writer's direction and at least the hint of a sense of meaning, as well as the writer's peculiarities of language. Only in this way can a collaborator such as myself hope to do anything more than polish the first draft of translation. That would have a wooden product, as the word polish implies. So I listen hard to all these matters attending the first draft. I mean, we literally convene and speak about them in an office or preferably in a house setting where we can feel isolated from all the other tasks that surround a university office. When live conversation cannot be easily had, for instance, when I was living 7 hours removed in the United States, then the slippery art of email must be used, and used quite carefully with bulleted points and much proofreading before letters are sent. I then drew upon a lifetime of careful reading, instituted in me by my mother, who was a literature major and a valedictorian of her college's senior class. Without her early professional reactions to my own first poems and to the poems that both of us knew from common reading, from the library of paperbacks that she supplied our house, I wouldn't have been able to cultivate my own set of criteria for what makes one line of poetry work better than another. I also credit my school teachers who strengthened and deepened my mother's fundamental critical/creative posture. I was raised on the moderns, and luckily the moderns still exert the primary influence on Arab poetry. Since the end of my education, I have been a ceaseless autodidact to postmodern expression, as perhaps all of my generation had to undergo. There were simply no teachers. You had to read the journals and then make of their poetry what you could. I've always sought out interviews with poets, and I've always had friends who were writing poetry. I have to draw on everything I've learned from the moderns, who were highly skilled at metaphor and allusions and careful cadence, and from the postmoderns who depend on contemporary pastiche, cut-up techniques, and above all, tonal disjunctions that are made to function like musical koans. Cadences spring from all aspects of the world: the humming of electric instruments, the blather of film scores, which incorporate sounds more than music. I put all these lessons about writing poetry in particular, because if you know poetry, you can deal with any other text to the final test. Can I sense the poet as a living human being? Can I channel something of his or her spirit? What's been of inestimable help to me is hearing poets talk and read their poetry. The tone of that first word, the cadence of the speech, it doesn't matter that I can only half follow their language textually. I'm following the heart and intelligence of their voice. Once I feel that I have that final element as it would emerge in English, a totally different language, then I can proceed with my job in some degree of confidence. With, of course, much to and froing with my primary translator, who herself has slipped on her second hat as co-creator of the many drafts that go into the final work. That's the end of John Verlenden. Now, back to me. John's last sentence about my having slipped on my second hat as co-creator reminds me of the question I have always posed. Can a person who is not a poet translate poetry? The best response I got was from the French translator of Adonis, Anne Wad-Minkowski. She said in her guest visit to a seminar I was teaching on literary translation that one could translate poetry if one were a poet or could have been a poet. She wrote an article entitled Traduire Adonis, in which she argued that the most challenging issue in translating an author known as untranslatable, like Adonis, touches on the very act of translation itself. Such translations need knowledge of the language that allows the inner ear to capture the cadences on one hand, and on the other hand, allows the eye and memory to find the necessary connections between diverse families of words. This is what she said about it. She goes on to say, en dehors de texte existe un contexte qu'il faut connaître au moins un peu. Outside the text, there is the context, and the translator should know it a little, un peu. This context that Minkowski asserts the translator has to be familiar with is equally important for the reader to know. Thus, an introduction to the author and his poetics are necessary for the audience as well. More and more in translation and in translation studies, the expected audience is taken into consideration. In our introduction to our translation of Chronicles of Qassim Haddad, we provided a glimpse of Qassim's background, upbringing, and educated in Bahrain. He's also an autodidact. A short section on Haddad's poetics and literary trajectory. An ample section on Majnun Layla as traveling classic from its presumed inception in the Arabian desert at the turn of the 8th century to its presence up till today in various formats and languages, in music and in painting, in drama and in dance. Finally, we wrote a section on translating a text that both presents Majnun Layla, that's the text of Qassim, while undermining the puritanical image of their love as it has come to be viewed. Qassim's use of intertext is ironic, allowing the couple to emerge as secular lovers with sensual passions, and with Layla declaiming her love far from her image as a passive beloved or a divine icon of Sufis as rendered by Nizami and Jami', among others. Haddad deconstructs the so-called historical portrait of Majnun by citing the contradictions in such reports, in such historical reports. So we as translators had to preserve this critical stance of Qassim while also capturing his diverse tones. We specifically did not opt for a free recreation, but for a responsible transcreation. We tried to present the Arabic poetry through English and not into English. We entrusted the reader to contribute to the process of reading by unpacking the different levels of tones in the Chronicles. Qassim often recounts the episodes that have become part of the story and legend of Majnun Layla, giving them a twist of his own. At times, he waxes lyrical about their love while conflating Majnun with the poetic persona, the first-person speaker in the poem. To help the reader adjust to new textual grids that represent different frames of expectations, not interiorized by English-speaking readers, we included a translation of a chapter from Qassim's memoir, Warshat al-Amal, in which he recalls an episode from his childhood in prose. We also included a poem of Qassim Haddad entitled He Was Told, O Muhammad, that represents the same touching episode but in verse. We also provided the reader with explanatory endnotes for terms or references that are not likely to be figured out, such as Hulu, the Bahraini pearl diving chant that we simply transliterated, or explained what suwak twigs are used for. For those readers who want to know our approach to translation, we wrote a short essay explaining our commitment to the original as well as to its poetic effect in English. So allow me to read one paragraph that's actually in the book about our translation strategy. Our translation approach is eclectic but hierarchical among its various orientations. While we initially locate the literal meaning of the Arabic in English, the nature of poetry and good prose demands that any other possible meanings be also noted and studied with an eye to teasing out subtextual motifs, linguistic tropes, and themes. Accordingly, literal meaning and secondary and tertiary meanings and more, if the translators aspire them, make up the initial level of concern. However, the aura, the evanescent and otherwise non-literal feel of the text is the greater concern, and if necessary, the literal level is subjugated in order for tonality, which also expresses a level of theme, and for the larger scene of the poetry's music to continue to develop a harmonious whole. In other words, sound and sense built upon literal meanings are considered simultaneously. End of this paragraph that defines our translation process. Finally, what are the pleasures and perils of collaborative translation? Let me start by the joys of translation in this mode. One is constantly carrying a dialogue with a partner, whom the French call an interlocuteur valable, or an appropriate interlocutor or addressee. One is constantly learning from each other in such collaboration. The final product is not a matter of compromise between 2 points of view as to wording to include, but a matter of the two of us fully agreeing on the final version. That, when reached, is really an ecstatic moment, akin to the ancient Greek philosopher and inventor Archimedes, who came out running with joy when he discovered the mathematical formula about water displacement when objects are immersed in it. Formerly, it was an intractable problem. He said, "Eureka, Eureka, I found it, I found it." But there are other pleasures that are not so instant as the pleasures of gaining knowledge of intricate verbal constructions and finding the right pitch for rendering them in another linguistic idiom. It is the pleasure of contributing to disseminating Arab culture and literature, to disseminate a marginalized culture into the global scene. Arab culture has been othered for too long, and it needs to find its place on the map of world poetry. I do not like to use the term marketing for diffusing a cultural product, and poetry is the last thing that can be marketed in today's world. However, there are ways of making poetry attractive, of raising the interest in poetry and reading. This is where the choice of material to be translated has to consider the global context and not only the local and regional contexts. Majnun Layla is practically a household name standing for passionate love. Isaac Disraeli saw in Majnun Layla echoes of Petrarch and Laura. André Miguel saw in it a parallel to Tristan and Isolde. Majnun and Layla speak to the world even though interpretation of their love varies from one culture to another, from one period to another. Our modern Majnun Layla of Qassim Haddad needs to be highlighted to take its part in world literature, contributing to a positive image of contemporary Arabs when the media focuses on the ugly Arab and the Muslim terrorist. While there are beautiful miniatures of Majnun Layla and their unrequited love from Central and Western Asia, we selected the cover painting from the London-based Iraqi painter Ziya al-Azzawi, since it corresponds in style to the modernity of Haddad's version. The perils are many. Not least of them is the satisfaction of the co-translators with a finale which is not necessarily faultless. This is where other sets of eyes are helpful. We showed the whole manuscript to our colleague Walid al-Hamamsi, who has a command of both Arabic and English and received an award for his poetry composed in English. His comments, as well as those of juries reading our manuscript, were most helpful in making revisions. Furthermore, we had a penultimate draft of our translation published in Kalima, the electronic bilingual cultural magazine edited by Sabri Hafiz, in anticipation for possible reactions of readers. When I received an unsolicited note of admiration from the well-known specialist on Majnun Layla and its different versions, As'ad Khairallah, professor of Arabic and world literature at the American University of Beirut, I knew we have done something right. As we said in our translated book, translation is always an adventure and a form of artistic ijtihad, an aesthetic interpretation. For those who undertake such adventures should also be ready for the risks of the journey. Now, I ended my talk, but there are 3 poems I can read in Arabic, and then we can listen to them in English in the southern accent of John Verlenden, Louisiana accent. The poems are الفتنة. The Arabic.
You found it. الفتنة. Yeah. Okay, this is it. Move it up a little. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. الفتنة. روى أبو الفرج الأصفهاني في أغانيه، وهو أغزر من نقل أخبار المجنون وأكثرهم نسجا ونقضا، كل ما يشكل على من يسعى لخبر كامل وحدث تام ونص غير مضطرب وموقف يحوطه اليقين. وفي هذا دالة على أن الرواية لم تكن تذهب إلى الخبر لكن إلى النص، وأن الحقيقة في هذا الموقف ليست بشيء، فالرواة يعبثون بالسيرة والأخبار تلهو بنا ويفتننا الشعر. This is a very short poem. See, he moves from recounting the story and quoting others to shorter poem or longer lyrical poems. This poem is called البكاء كله. قيل له ماذا لو أن ليلى لم تكن؟ قال لكنت بكيت البكاء كله لكي تكون.
عجبي.
This is not from the Chronicles, but from another diwan. أنت الموسيقى وأنا الرقص، كالرقص المتمرد في السهول الرهراها، أتموج وأنت موسيقاي. ينداح معي الزرع وتنهض الزوبعة، وتنهد الحلمة الراهقة في خطواتي. أمشي ليس على الأرض، أطير ليس في الهواء، فأنا الرقص وأنت موسيقاي. شكراً. الآن ستسمعون الترجمة ريكوردينج بتاع جون في نفس الترتيب، يعني القصائد.
I'll read 3 poems by Qassim Haddad. The first 2 from Chronicles of Majnun Layla, and the third from his selected poetry. Enticement. Al-Asfahani, the most prolific transmitter of Majnun's accounts, with brilliant command in weaving and unweaving Majnun's chronicles, related in his Agani all that compromises a complete report, a firm account, a coherent text, or a definitive position. No doubt this was a sign that Al-Asfahani's narrative failed to verify the full account, opting for the pleasing text. Thus, the truth of such assertions contains no significance. Transmitters monkey with the truths of lives, their anecdotes making monkeys of us, while poetry entices. All the weeping. He was told, "What if Layla were not?" He said, "I would have wept her into existence." You are the music, I am the dance, from selected poems. Forbidden dance in the sweeping veils. I undulate, you, my music. Plants swell alongside me, a storm arises. The nipple of youth sighs, all in my step. Walking, not on earth, flying, not in air. I, the dance, you, the music.
Thank you, Ferial. This is a magnificent introduction to collaborative translation. And congratulations again. We have time for questions and comments. تفضل.
أنتم الناس أيها الشعراء، ترجمة تضافرية، ترجمة تضافرة، collaborative بس بالعربي قوي. ما أحلى وقع هاتين الكلمتين على الأذن. How delicious, how beautiful. أنت صوتي هاتين الكلمتين لترجمة التضافر.
عجبتك ترجمة التضافر؟ لأنه من فكرة الظفيرة يعني you played something you have two but cooperation تعاون يعني تعاونية. I just chose this word to do it. Buthaina?
I didn't understand how did you do it, both of you? I mean, did you take, say, two poems to translate? He took another poems to translate, or did you take the same poem? And I mean, how did you do it?
Yeah. Okay. The first thing is to choose the poet that we want to work on, you know. So I like Qassim Haddad very much. I like his poetry very much. And within his poetry, I mean, he has several diwans and so on. I thought the most appropriate one to choose, I mean, I like many of them, you know, especially the latter works, maybe not as much as the earlier works, which are more sort of direct and more political and so on. I wanted to choose something for translation that will speak to the audience, you know. So if you do it on let's say Taraf ibn al-Abd, you know, people don't know who Taraf ibn al-Abd is. I mean, we think very highly of him. He is, you know, very important in our culture, but for them it means nothing. But when you do Majnun Layla, it means something to them. So I thought that would help us in introducing him, in translating him and introducing his work and so on. That's one thing, okay? And then we thought that if we want to present the poet, it's important to present samples of his other works so that you can see him, you know, you can see his, you know, poetic trajectory or development and so on. So anyway, once we decided to do this, you know, of course, I read and he read a lot about whatever is available on Qassim Haddad in criticism, comments, and so on. And then we start with the poem, and I will translate it first, kind of a literal translation, and then another translation is what I think, you know, you can't just translate things literally in poetry and so on. A more, let's say, a more poetic or a more literary translation and so on. And then you look at it and we'll sit and discuss things because you can't put everything in writing and so on. But he has two models, you know, sometimes more, sometimes three models. And then we'll discuss the words and the peculiarities, the significance of syntax and things like this and so on, okay? And then, you know, he will translate. I mean, we didn't necessarily do it poem by poem. Like I'll do, you know, a few poems and send it to him, and then he'll do it, and then we'll sit and discuss it and so on. And then he'll propose something, and I'll say, well, this doesn't work here, it works here, not there, and so on, and so on. We continue to discuss it until we come to a version that is both he thinks it's fine and I think it's fine. And that's when it is, I wouldn't say it's the final version, it's the penultimate version. It's the version before the last, and so on. And we go on doing like this with all the poetry, with the whole collection of Chronicles of Majnun Layla. until we're finished. Then we showed it to a colleague, Walid, who looked at it, and then we published it electronically in Kalima so that we can get a reaction, and we get reactions and so on. I mean, my first attitude was to translate the title, which is Akhbar Majnun Layla. How do you translate Akhbar Majnun Layla? I mean, he's also making fun of the akhbar, which are not really truthful historical accounts. They are made up and so on. So at first I thought of doing something which it's a French word, but it's also used in English, which is Majnun Layla encore. You know, it's one more time where we have it and so on. But, you know, not everybody thought of this, so we settled on the idea of the Chronicles. But of course, it's Chronicles in a very ironic way, because we think of Chronicles as history. We think of history as factual. But he's really trying to show there is nothing factual, you know. It has all been changed, and it's contradictory events and so on and so forth.
Did you have a question, Humphrey? Yeah, all the way in the back, please.
Which one?
What?
I understood that you did most of your work at a distance. Is that correct?
No,
Back and forth on...
actually, we did most of it together.
Okay.
Here in Cairo. But, you know, there were times when he wasn't around, and we did that by...
I see.
By email, which he referred to, yeah.
Okay, the question still works, because I was thinking it's two presumably very different modes, sitting across a table from somebody and hearing their voice as they read the poetry, and even their body language and a whole range of things. And then the other one, in which even at a distance, one supposes there may be some advantages in that you perhaps have to work harder to explain and to make absolutely clear. Yeah. And whether you have a preference for one mode or the other, I think both are essential to the process.
Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, my tendency will be to do it face to face, you know, where you can, you know, not just write something. How much can you write, you know, to explain something when orally you can meet with someone and so on. But most of it, as he says, we did it in a house. Sometimes we would meet in an office, in the university office, but then there are all telephones coming, students coming, and so on. So we decided to meet at home, you know, and discuss these things and so on. But I want to say something. Now we have something like Skype. I have actually supervised an entire MA thesis by Skype, because I was away, and then when I came back, the person was away, and so on. So Skype is really very helpful, you know. You can see the person and talk about things and so on. So it takes the place maybe of email and of writing and so on.
Well, first of all, I'd like to thank you for a reassuring speech about collaborative translation, because this is something that is often ignored. It's not an option that a lot of translators choose, but thank you for giving us faith in collaborative translation. I have two questions. One about the quotation from Salma Khadra Jayusi that you mentioned, where she said that poetry cannot be translated except by a poet, and I often think this is a bit unfair. I mean, somebody who has sensibility for poetry can, at least for me, in my opinion, can translate poetry, not necessarily a poet. My other question is about the fact that in the case of the collaborative translation you are describing, it was not only collaborative translation, it was also done by the other person. I mean, you obviously, you know Arabic and English, but the other person also knows Arabic and English. So in that case, do you think it would have been the same if the other person who was translating was only an American poet who does not know Arabic very well, or had not studied Arabic literature well?
Well, actually, John did not know Arabic very well, but, you know, had lived in the Arab world. You know, he knew enough Arabic, you know, to figure out things and so on. But I wouldn't say, you know, he could possibly take these poems and read them on his own and figure what they are on and so on. But let me just say about Salma Khadra Jayusi. And that's why I refer to the translator of Adonis, who said you could be either a poet, either you are a poet or you could have been a poet, you know. So in other words, you know, whatever that means, you know, you have the sensibility that you are saying and so on. So, you know, you can take it or leave it. But I think, generally speaking, I mean, I love poetry and I read poetry and so on, but I don't, you know, I don't write poetry, not in Arabic, not in English. So I think, I mean, I have done translation. I did Muhammad Suleiman, the Solomon Rex. I translated it by myself, you know, and it was published and so on. But somehow I feel it's always more fun to have a partner. For one thing, when I translate, I can't really decide this word or that word, this inflection or that inflection. I can't be decisive in these things and so on. So it's nice to have somebody who takes the responsibility of telling you, you can do this or you can't do that, you know. It just adds, you know, to it, you know. It's like even when you write an article and so on, you know, you like to show it to someone who tells you, but you were not clear there, or your argument falters there, or something like that, you know. But in his part is more than that, you know. And then it's nice that I translate it in a certain way, and then I can see what he does to it. I mean, there's a kind of magic, poetic magic, you know, that turns the text into actual poetry.
I want to ask a question. I'm fascinated by the fact that you have this long history with the same person in co-translation. And I'm guessing that, like any other sort of project, long-range project, you know, you start off with certain strategies, and then you revisit them, redefine them. There's a history to this relationship. Has it changed over time? Have you changed the way you work? Have you adopted new...
I mean, I would have to, because now he is retired from AUC and he's in New Orleans and so on. So if we do something, I mean, I would like to do Abu Nawas. That's what I would like to do, you know. He's a modernist. Abu Nawas is as modernist as you can get.
They'll arrest you for it.
But the thing is that, let's say in the beginning, maybe we spent a lot of time, you know, explaining things and so on. As you work with someone, you know, you can use more economy in how you present something, because you've become closer to each other and you know what's expected or what's not expected and so on, you know. So in that sense, it becomes easier with time, okay? That familiarity becomes helpful, you know, that we have gone through it and we know what it is and so on and so forth. I don't know if I've really answered your question. Or so.
Well, I guess it's something to reflect on, maybe, you know, over time, you know, how has this developed?
But as I said, I mean, you can't just bring someone who is a scholar in one language and another one who is a poet in the target language and put them together. I mean, there must be a chemistry that works. And it doesn't always work. I mean, I translated a poem by Mata for Salma, when Salma was doing her modern Arabic poetry. It was by Muhammad Afifi Mata, and it was called Qira'ah, recital. But it's very Quranic allusions and echoes and so on. And she gave it to Desmond O'Grady. He was a poet, an Irish poet, and so on. And you know, he translated it. I've used something, the cover, you know, that is used. I use mantle, because we talk about the mantle of the prophet. And he changed it to cape. Now, cape is not the same. I mean, given the context, I mean, in some poems, yes, you could have a cape, but this is not, we're talking about, you know, the mantle of the prophet. I mean, it's almost like, that's what people know and so on. And she did not object to it. And so there was no way for me to tell him, to explain to him why cape does not work here, you know, and so on. That's why I like to have someone with whom I can have a dialogue and explain things and, you know, come to a conclusion, you know, satisfactory conclusion for both. So on. But I remember she also told me that she wanted, she had the translation by an Arabic scholar of Ibrahim Nagy, your grandfather, and she gave it, I think, to O'Grady or to somebody else. I can't remember who, you know. And she said it came back jazzy, looking like jazz, not the romantic poet. It just didn't work. I mean, she could tell that there are certain things that don't work and so on. But she was the ultimate judge, There was no give and take between me and the translator, although I knew, of course, Desmond O'Grady myself.
Yeah. Susan, we have a question here for you.
My voice doesn't carry very well. Well, thank you very much, Ferial. This is a wonderful presentation. And as you know, we took advantage of both your text and your cover last year at Georgetown for our presentations on Qassim Haddad, as well as your own presentation there. In terms of this, the issue of collaborative translation, all of these things, a couple of things strike me, because we read a lot in translation theory about this. But in the end, the only thing that matters is the result. The proof of the pudding is in the eating, and it doesn't really matter how it got there.
Sure.
What strikes me about something like this, I don't know John Verlenden's own poetry, but it seems to me that he has a very nice touch for these modern things. I mean, they really, not only do they sound, much like Qassim Haddad in many ways, there's the same sort of aesthetic there, but also it sounds like real modern American poetry too. It doesn't sound alien and translated. So my other question is, if you could compare the issues of translating somebody like Afifi Matar and translating someone like Qassim Haddad, that would be interesting to hear how the experiences differed in terms of translation.
Yes, I want to say that there is a danger. I talked about the perils of translation, collaborative translation, is that the poet will turn every Arabic poem into his, it's very possessive, So it will be more like Verlenden poetry than it would be like Qassim Haddad or like Muhammad Afifi Matar and so on. But I'm watching. So if he does this, I'm going to say, no, you can't do that, and so on, I mean, look at the way Ezra Pound translated. I mean, recreated the poem based on something, that he read in Chinese or in ancient Egyptian poetry and so on. I mean, it's really Ezra Pound. It's no more ancient Egyptian poems of love that he translated, for example, So that's also the advantage of having two people, Everyone is going to defend the source or the target, so on. But Qassim Haddad is a modernist, and he says this, that Arabic poetry has been very much influenced by modern poetry, modern European, modern this and so on. And the very title of Matar, Quartet of Joy, But also, why did we choose this one of Matar? Because he emphasizes 4 kinds of joys, the 4 elements: the earth, air, water, and fire. Okay, which is very kind of universal. I shouldn't say universal, but it certainly was in the Middle Ages. The Greeks had it. It's something that people relate to, So there's the divisions there and so on. I mean, I could have gotten something that's really very, very different. And I mean, the qira'ah recital, the one I translated of Matar, is also very much anchored in Arab Islamic poetics, But we did it.
Okay, we take questions from here. And then Mona, بعدين فاتح.
عيناك يا أنثاي قالت ما لم تكن لغتي لغة تغلب قيصر في ضعفها أضوء في ترس أميري أو ربما عادت إلي مراهقتي لا تعبئي بهرمي قد شاب شعري فهبت قافيتي فانحنت قائمتي أمام عيناك عيناك تتوضأ الدنيا من عيناك تتفطر عيناي حزنا أمام عيناك. مسائكم شعرا. أنا استمتعت جدا بالدكتوراه، وخاصة عندما ألقت الضوء على الشاعر محمد عفيفي مطر. ولكن السؤال اللي أنا بوجهه لها، إزاي قدرت تترجمي الصورة بتاعت الشاعر محمد عفيفي مطر مع إن الصورة بتاعته بترجع إلى الريف المصري، القرية المصرية، الشرفات، المصباح، المنضدة. فالصورة بتاعت الشاعر محمد عفيفي مطر إزاي قدرت الدكتورة تترجمها إلى اللغة الإنجليزية؟ وشكرا.
يعني هو محمد عفيفي مطر شاعر فلسفي إلى حد كبير، فهذه طبعا تساعد. طبعا كان لازم أفهم المصطلحات الريفية المصرية. يعني مثلا كان عنده قصيدة أنا أتذكر ذاكر فيها جسر. نحن جسر عندنا بالفصحى أو باللهجة العراقية يعني بريدج، بينما هو الجسر هناك يعني الجانب اللي قريب من النهر. فبعدين اكتشفت طبعا المسألة وعرفتها. يعني في أشياء مرات من كنت أترجم مثلا إدوار الخراط. أنا صار لي سنين عايشة في مصر، يعني المفروض أعرف المصري والمصطلحات دي، بس كنت بترجم فهو بيتكلم عن عفريتة صفراء. طب أنا العفريتة الصفراء يعني yellow جني or something like this، يعني how do you translate it and so on. يعني استغربت، يعني هاي ما تدخل بالسياق. وهذه طبعا هنا الزميل الشاعر ما يقدر يساعدني، يعني ما يعرف عربي لهالدرجة. بس أنا من نوع الأسأل، يعني لمن شيء ما أقتنع به أسأل البقية يعني. فاكتشفت إنه العفريتة الصفراء هي الأوفرول اللي يلبسوه الناس يعني. بس أنا طبعا ما كان عندي هالمعرفة. هو أصعب شيء بالشعر في ترجمة الشعر أنا في نظري it's when you think you know what it is. When you know you don't know something or you're not sure of it, you look it up, you ask, you check, you do all these things and so on. But when you think you know it, and it turns to be not the right one, you know? Yeah.
Okay, we have two more questions. Okay.
Thank you, Dr. Ghazoul, for a most fascinating presentation. The reason I'm here today is basically because you are talking, so we can't miss that. And the second reason is that I'm interested in collaborative translation because I've been practicing collaborative translation with Marsha Lennox Quayle, the American translator. We have been doing that for a couple of years without actually giving it a name. How we did it is that if the text is from English into Arabic, Marsha would do all the work and then I'll be editing that. If the text is from Arabic into English, meaning into her native language, I'll be doing the core work and she would be editing that. And we did that quite harmoniously, but we never actually thought of giving it a name, and we never actually thought how we did it. We just did it and we did it all right. Now, since you are a much more experienced collaborative translator, can you give us a manifesto for future generations of people who want? Yes, no. Sort of.
No. But
guideline.
I want to tell you something.
Okay.
How do you think theory
was
comes
that the
about?
best way to do it? Sorry?
How do you think theory comes in translation studies? How do you have theory?
Practice.
From practice. It starts with practice. You know, you formalize what you do. And then you see how it is. Now, how did I come? I mean, I didn't think before of the difference between collaborative and cooperative. But when I was asked to give this lecture, I began to think because, you know, there is, if we talk about solo translators, you know, you could be a translator, as I said, who is a native speaker of the source language, or you could be a translator of the target language and so on. And they call them, I mean, they have names for them. A, B, you know, translator, independent translator, A, B, you know, they do something like this and so on. So I was thinking, you know, there is a difference between what Radwa, for example, did. They were all native speakers of Arabic, isn't it, Fatah? And it was a critical work anyway, you know. And between someone who combines, like you do, you know, someone who is different either in terms of native speaker of this language or that language, or discipline is different, you know.
So I
For example, would you translate literature or do you translate something else? Only literature. Yeah.
Only literature. I mean, at least this is what we worked on
This
together.
is what you worked on.
Literature, yes.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I think more research should be done on this point because it's very interesting.
In translation studies, we need to do that. I mean, the Chinese are very good in it. You know, they've done it. And as I said, there is a conference in Hong Kong precisely about this, you know. And Muna Bakers will be one of the keynote speakers there. Although she herself told me there isn't much done on collaborative. If you look in her encyclopedia of translation studies, there's nothing under collaborative thing. There is something,
actually
whenever
very
you look at it, you will find team translation, and it's usually scriptures or, you know, diplomatic documents and so on.
Or very long works or something, like encyclopedias or something. Right.
I mean, you have to be careful when you have a co-translator that the other person does not put you down or you don't put down the other person. I mean, it has to be, there should be some kind of equilibrium and understanding of each other, you know?
Well, but when I think of it, we are good friends basically, so this facilitated a lot of work together. Yeah. And we both love translation, and I think this is a basic line. Being on good terms. Being
on good terms. But I mean, I know that
being
Steve,
able to
for
understand
example,
each other.
Steve has translation. Steve Nemes, my chair, sitting back there. He translates with a student. Now, I wondered how this works into power dynamics. You know, because students tend to be willing to please their professors. And I don't want somebody to be willing to please me. I want to defend, you know, their version or what they want to do.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Doctor.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ferial. I'm actually one of the students of Dr. Ferial referred to earlier, and congratulations. I just would like to share with you an experience, my experience after having lived with a translator of poetry for more than 20 years.
Hassan.
Yes, and I think this ties in with what Granda's, you know, comment on the poet translating poetry. And I would like to add that after 20 years of translating poetry, he discovered that he was a poet. So I mean, you know, I mean, you discovered yourself as
you
well.
You are a potential poet.
Exactly, you know. So my question is, have you ever come across, because this, I happen to be his reader sometimes, just because he would, if he doesn't find any of his, you know, poet friends, then he resorts.
He translated American poetry into Arabic, right?
Yes,
Hassan.
and he translates into English as well.
He translates Arabic into English as well, both ways.
But sometimes, and often I meet this, you know, I read, basically, if it were a prose poem, and when he renders it, to me, it sounds more poetic than the original.
Than the original.
Than the original.
He improves on the original.
And a lot of times, I mean, I think one of the poems, you know, that we just read here, you know, when it's rendered into the other language, the tone kind of changes, and sometimes it sounds more poetic. Now, in this case, you know, have you come across something like this, and what would you do, you know? Would you, like, you know, try to retranslate or make it, tone it down, or I don't know if you've experienced any of this?
Well, you know, I mean, there are certain things that sort of, let's say, could read better in another language than in the original. It is possible, you know. But, I mean, there's also a question of taste, you know, what you think is a better poem, you know. I mean, the whole thing is really, to a great extent, subjective, you know. So it depends, you know, what we do. But I think what you said first, I thought that was very interesting, that people who have done translation of poetry then becomes a poet.
It rubs
you know?
off.
What?
It rubs off.
It is true.
Yes.
It is true, you know. I think that's an interesting phenomenon. I haven't gotten that far.
Yes, but, you know, my second point, it has to do with the intentionality. Probably of the poet, you know, or the writer in general. I mean, if someone intends to write, you know, a poem, but, you know, free or in prose form, then I don't think someone has the right to make it like, you know, sounding a little bit more different than what the intention was, or I don't know.
Or
Or
the
probably
author,
who knows what the
author.
intention, the poet's intention
Yeah.
was in the first
well,
place.
you know, the idea of the author is dead and so on.
Yeah,
I don't believe in
no.
it. I don't believe in it. I think you should, whenever you can, you should be able to talk to the author, or read about what other people have said about the author and so on. And as John said, he likes to hear them actually, the way they talk and so on. I mean, I think it's important, but I don't think the author is the ultimate decision maker on what the poem means, Yeah, sure. We have a number of poets, Melville said, Moby Dick is not symbolic. I mean, come on, Melville, that's not the way it is. I mean, people do say something, do sometimes say things that, to me, it doesn't make sense. I mean, he is the author of the work. He can tell me this was my intention, but then the poem is also my poem, because I'm the reader. So I have a part in it, I have a say in it, I have a role in deciphering it, and so on, And some of them, first of all, many of them don't want to talk, about it. I mean, Picasso was always asked about Guernica to explain this symbol, that symbol. He said, if I want to explain it, I would have written about it. But I painted it, and it's for you to do the work.
And how did Qassim Haddad like the translation?
Sorry?
What did he say about the translation?
Qassim Haddad's English is not as good as, definitely is not as good as Al-Kharat. Kharat was a commander, had a command of English. Matar knew English, but he always said he didn't know it very well, the idea that but I think Qassim's English is not that way, is not, he did not, he did not comment. I don't think he can comment, on it, I mean, he was very happy to see the book in English, but apart from that, I don't think he's in a position to tell me whether he liked or not liked, and so on. And he really didn't want to have a say, because I like always to ask him, about certain things, and what do you think? Because, he doesn't have to read the translation. I could tell him, is this what in a way it means, or it is this way or that way, and so on. And he didn't want to get into that. That's your job. You want to do it, you do it.
Okay, interesting. Thanks, Dr.
The final question. Here it is.
Thank you very much. I wanted to ask you about this particular collaborative experience with John. From what you explain, your roles are very clearly demarcated. You know the Arabic, you translate textually, and you do a first draft that is more towards a creative text. And he, the poet, comes in and he turns that text into a more poetic text, a very clear process. Is that only instigated by poetry? If you were translating a prose text, would you still engage in collaborative translation with this translator or any other? Or is that something that only poetry made you think of?
Yeah, I mean, it is not just as mechanical as this, that I give a draft and he does another draft. I mean, we have discussion, we have, so on. We did translate Adu al-Kharat, Rama wa Tanin, which is a highly poetic text. I mean, it's prose, but it's Kharat's prose, which is akin to poetry and so on. No, I want to say something about translation. I translate without having to have someone help me, critical essays. I mean, I don't need anybody else to tell me how to translate them, because that's my identity, I'm a critic, so I can translate without them. But when it comes to poetry or prose and so on, I translated a short story by Anita Desai, and it was not difficult. Anita Desai's style, it's very similar. I mean, I was not, there was no challenge, It was very easy to translate, And I always want in translation to have something that is difficult to do. I mean, it's riwayat al-sa'ab. Yeah. She wants to say something, Bathayna.
When Mr. Dennis Johnson
translated you.
Translate a selection of my stories. He's a great translator,
Absolutely.
of course. But he used to show me the translations before
but you know English well.
Yeah, I know English. So I had to correct him in two instances, you know. One of the stories was describing an Iraqi woman putting the black cloak, al-abaya, what do you call it? Black cloak? Abaya. And I discovered that he described it as if she is an Egyptian woman putting an abaya. You know, we dress differently with abaya. We put it on our head. He said that, he translated that she puts the abaya on her shoulders.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, if I hadn't been knowing English, I wouldn't be able to correct him. You know? This is one instance, and the other.
The local color, the local things that can be a problem. Because you think you are in Egypt, you know, the Iraq, but the Iraq is different. Yeah.
You said something in your presentation which was very important about this, that a translator should know the traditions and everything about the culture of the. The other story, I was describing a woman who was hit, a simple poor woman who was hit with the news of her, of the death of her small child. She, you know, a simple poor woman wouldn't sit on a chair collected, and you know, she would do something with her hands, hitting herself or doing, and she was. I described her sitting on the ground. I mean, she's doing, trying to express her sorrows in every way we know about it. So he described her sitting on a chair, and she was just as, you know, as if she is a stranger. I mean. So I had to correct him in this. I said, no, we don't.
It's good of him that he gave you the material to look at.
Yeah. But these, you know, these are culture differences.
Yes,
you know?
yes, no, of course.
So it's important that a translator should know everything about the culture of the source. You know. Yeah. Thank you.
Faiza.
Wow.
Faiza.
I just want to ask you, do you think that after you translate, the reader should feel that this, say, is an Egyptian or an Iraqi or whatever, that the character, the original character, should remain strong? Or does it become international?
No, I mean, it doesn't become international except that people can read it. It is, you know, it's becomes international in the sense that people can read something that was written, for example, by Buthaina, which was only available in Arabic, okay? But I don't think the character ought, you know, the character ought to have the characteristics that was given in the short story or in the poem and so on.
I was thinking of what you said about Ezra Pound. I did completely dislike.
About?
Ezra Pound.
Yeah.
And Foster and certain people like that are making it
a different poem. Make it Ezra Pound.
Yeah.
He's writing Ezra Pound, but saying it's you know love poems from this. But then but you can still enjoy it. You can still enjoy it, but don't think this is the way ancient Egyptians wrote about love. You can enjoy it for what it is. Yeah, I mean, I am very. I like to have the original, you know, in it and so on, and not just use it to do something else, you know. But there are a lot of poets who do this, you know. They read something that has been translated by someone else. I think they have done a lot of this with Rumi, you know. There are so many translations of Rumi. People who don't know Farsi at all, you know, but they just read something and then they do that. I mean, that's also is possible. I mean, that's not my line, you know. That's not what it is.
Shouldn't there be some kind of rules that if you are translating, the ethics of translation would be to keep it?
Because there are different modes of translation. There's adaptations. There is somebody who is inspired by a certain poem or a certain thing, and then writes a poem and so on. I mean, you are saying, why do we call all this translation? You know, you want to have different terms for it and so on.
Yeah. Inspiration maybe is inspired. But if he's translating,
translating.
I think you should keep the feeling of the country you're translating.
The feeling of the source,
the original
of the
language.
source, of the source. Yeah. You have a comment, Fatin?
In the case of Pound,
give her the.
Yeah, but in the case of Pound, he wrote about this. You know, I mean, all the modernists had this idea of translation, apocryphal translation, and all the rest of it. You know, so they had these, pastiches and apocryphal translations like Borges and Ezra Pound. So they did have a special theory about this. It's not that they were not honest or anything, they did mean, to...
but it is a form of appropriation of the other.
Yes,
and this is what is annoying Faiza, because she is an Egyptologist and she can read these poems in the original.
Of course, I understand,
but this is what they did with Omar Khayyam, the translation of Fitzgerald, of Omar Khayyam. I mean, it's, it's not really Omar Khayyam, but I don't know what you call this, you'll call it, there are different levels of translation, different modes of translation and so on. And you just have to be careful that when you read a translation of a work or of a poem, don't, assume that this is it. I always think that what is good about translation is that when you read something, I mean, if you read Ezra Pound and so on, if you are interested in it and so on, then you want to see how it is done, either by another translator. There are other translations of the love poems, or you even want to learn hieroglyphics to read these love poems and so on. Well, not everybody does this, but some people will.
No, I was thinking maybe there were some kind of...
To different terms. Rules, yeah. No, but I think as Fatin said, the translator should explain, what they did. I mean, we all know Ezra Pound did not know Chinese, but he translated from Chinese, I mean, we have to have the different names, for translation, adaptation, inspiration, what have you, and so on and so forth. Yeah. It's used in a very loose term, translation. And even in lectures here, sometimes you have somebody, for example, talking about a film that was made based on a novel, and this is called translation, right? I mean, the term translation includes so many ways of using some else.
You think that it really means to carry across, to translate is to carry across. Then, under this larger umbrella, everything is possible, so long as you are carrying across, I guess.
No, but in many disciplines, there are rules, there are ethics. You do this if you are translating a person. The person can normally sue you if you are not translating it properly, if you're changing it completely.
But this is where the origin is also a very controversial term, the original, I mean, how do you know what Qassim Haddad really said? It's my interpretation of Qassim Haddad, Could be somebody else read him and see something else in him, and so on, And this is, of course, becomes very clear when you translate scripture, the different readings, of a certain ayah or something like that, They call it interpretation, but the meaning of, for the Quran, but for the Bible, it's translation. It's called translation, okay? And it's just because there's a theological issue that it should not be translated and so on, that people don't call the translations of the Quran translation, but they are, for all purposes, a translation. Okay, I mean. You never can reproduce what is in the source language exactly there. You can never do that. That's impossible. It's an impossible task. But you can approximate it,
Thank you very much, Ferial. الدكتورة هي اللي بتاخد الشعر في الحياة.
لا. Shukran. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much again.
No.
Thank you, Ferial. It was wonderful. And congratulations one more time.